Now, this week, the US President Donald Trump signed an executive order to begin dismantling the Department of Education. Mr. Trump said it was the right thing to do, and he hopes the whole department can be shut down, quote, as quickly as possible. However, the final decision to eradicate the department will need to be approved by the US Congress. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from London by the Republican strategist and chair of Republicans Overseas UK, Greg Swenson. Great to see you, Greg. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just explain to us President Trump's thinking in dismantling the US Department of Education.
Yeah, I think it's a long time coming, Charles. Most conservatives have wanted this for a very long time. And, the U.S. education system was doing just fine before the Department of Education was formed in 1980 or 1979 and 80 with Jimmy Carter in the White House. But, a little history is important here. And then I think, you can understand why President Trump is getting rid of it. It's really just become a conduit for toxic DEI ideology, as well as just a complete waste of money, waste of taxpayer money. Most of the funding, as well as most of the management for education in the U.S., comes at the state and local level. But the department was formed by Jimmy Carter because he wanted to pay back the teachers' unions who had helped him get elected in 1976 and were helping to run for re-election in 1980. We know how that worked out. But I do think that this is something that Ronald Reagan immediately, even during the campaign in 1980, was calling for getting rid of the Department of Education because it's just another layer of bureaucracy and a complete waste of money. Basically, they funnel funds to school districts where they want votes, but also where they think that more money will solve an educational challenge, which is obviously not true. So it's a long time overdue. A lot of Republican presidents, including Reagan, have been talking about disbanding it for generations. And finally, President Trump's the first one to actually do it.
Well, let's face it, Greg. They've had a fairly good impact on educational and on training opportunities. And I'm wondering what sort of impacts that'll have. What about the money, for example, that funds special education and low-income children? Has that money now gone away?
Yeah, no, it won't go away because, again, most of it's funded at the state and local level. And if there's supplemental funds that need to come from the government, those will come from different departments in Washington. So the truth is they're not really getting rid of everything in the Department of Education. And you're quite right, Charles. It has to be done to officially shut it down. It has to be done by Congress, and the president knows that. But in the meantime, he's moving a lot of the functions that are important to other areas. Now, one of the biggest expenditures from the DOE is student loans for university students. That will be much better handled, first of all, better handled by the private sector. But in the meantime, that will be moved to Treasury because the Department of Education has really become a student loan bank, and they're clearly not equipped to do that. But in terms of things like supplemental funds for cities or states that need extra money for special ed, of course, that will just be moved to the Department of Human Services, which is where it was for generations prior to 1980. So I don't think that all of the spending will be cut, but a lot of it will be, because most of it is just wasteful spending going to grants and loans for frivolous DEI ideology, and that's something that's going to be removed from just about every government agency.
But correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, but if you move all the money to a different department and all of a sudden there are no other employees in the Department of Education, who are going over to the other departments, doesn't that mean that the knowledge base is gone?
Well, yeah, I hope it's gone, because so much of what the Department of Education has become is just a bureaucratic layer of hostility to not only the private sector, but really positive movements like school choice and charter schools, all the things that have demonstrated to be so much better than the monopoly that is the public schools. But again, the teachers unions are really behind this. They get a lot of the politicians elected, and then they're paid back with these massive grants coming from the federal unelected administrative state in Washington. So they're going to remove a lot of the administrative or bureaucratic bloat and push the education and even education funding back to the states, back to the local communities. That's what's worked. And it's interesting to look at the outcomes of the Department of Education. Education standards and outcomes have gone straight down since this department was funded, and at great expense to American taxpayers. So I think you'll see an improvement in schools. And one of the things that's going hand in hand with getting rid of or removing the Department of Education as a separate entity is much more efficiency, but also a movement again toward school choice, toward scholarship schools. The underprivileged children in big American cities are suffering because they're stuck in teachers union controlled public schools. Whenever they're offered an alternative like charter schools or vouchers where they're just given a voucher and they can choose the school that they want to go to, they all end up going to private schools. By the way, they're the same private schools or charter schools where the teachers unions send their children to, and also the governments, the governors and mayors in these towns. In Chicago, for example, J.B. Pritzker, the governor, his children go to private school. His children go to schools that cost a lot of money, but the public schools are actually more expensive than the private school alternatives, but they're paid for by the taxpayer. So this is an opportunity to really improve the education system in the U.S., and it's really desperate. We really need that help.
And I mean, the president says he wants to do this as quickly as possible. I mean, doesn't that worry you in terms of people who are affected trying to prepare for the next step?
No, because the people that will be affected are the bureaucrats in Washington. It won't affect children. In fact, if anything, it will improve the lots of children that are suffering in these big urban school systems that really don't look after the children. They just look after the teachers unions. So the faster that the spigot is cut off to the teachers unions, the faster that these students can move to alternative schools that are so much better for them and for their parents. So that movement's been happening for a while, Charles. It's not new, but it needs to be liberated because so many of the teachers unions are so opposed to alternative schools and school choice that they're doing their best to keep those the really monopoly structures in place, and cutting off their funds will be really useful toward accomplishing better education systems.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. I mean, if you ask me, there's clearly a problem with education, not just in America, but everywhere else. But that doesn't mean that you have to get rid of the place that's doing it, does it?
Yeah, no, they're not doing it. Schools are managed and provided at the state and local level. All the Department of Education does is throw money at the teachers unions or make student loans to university students, which is much better handled by the private sector. So they're not cutting out education here. This is just a bureaucracy that's, if anything, a hindrance to the education at the state and local level. So this is good news for students.
Greg, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Charles.
We appreciate your taking the time to talk to us. Greg Swenson is a Republican strategist and chair of Republicans Overseas UK. He was talking to me on the line there from London.